everyone. I'm Don Keelan, and this is The Truth of the Matter. Today, I have a very special guest that came down from Montpelier, Todd Daloz, the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Vermont. Welcome, Todd, to the show.
Thanks, Don. It's great to be here.
Todd and I are going to be chatting for about 30 minutes about the nonprofit environment in Vermont, the nonprofit organization environment, and primarily because the Attorney General's office in Vermont has that responsibility. And Todd, so again, thank you for being here.
Sure.
And for background, let me just put this in perspective, and you'll jump in at any time. But the Attorney General's office does govern the area of nonprofits. Is that correct?
We're one of two state agencies or state entities that do. The Secretary of State is primarily responsible for incorporation and things like that. But as far as charities go, and I think there are a number of different terms we'll probably discuss today, but as far as charities go, the Vermont Attorney General's office has the primary responsibility for overseeing how charities and largely nonprofits operate in Vermont.
I'm going to ask you later on about exactly how do you go about doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, let me just put this in some sort of perspective for our audience. I did speak with the folks at the Secretary of State's office,
mm-hmm.
and they informed me that they have registered, as of the last week, a little over 14,000 nonprofits in Vermont. And of that number, 2,000, give or take, have been on a terminated list with them. There are about 5,000 that are inactive, and they are following approximately 7,400 active nonprofits. That's quite a few.
It's a lot of organizations. It's a lot of individuals. It represents a tremendous volunteer spirit. That's a big part of Vermont. It also represents a big part of Vermont's economy. I think the Vermont Community Foundation, maybe 6 years ago, is the most recent time they did a review of this. Estimated that there's somewhere around $4 billion in assets in the nonprofit sector in Vermont, and upwards of 14% of employment in Vermont is through nonprofit organizations. So it's a tremendous piece of our economy, and it's an area where I think a tremendous amount of good is being done, and it's important that somebody's out there kind of keeping an eye on it as well, beyond the volunteers who take charge of a lot of these organizations through boards.
We'll talk about a publication from your office, but a recent publication from your office did note that almost 20% of the Vermont gross state product, or basically put it in a simple way, 20% of the state's economy is in the nonprofit. It comes from the nonprofit sector, with $8 billion of assets under their control and $4 billion of revenue. That's a huge industry. The other thing, just to put this in another form of another perspective, that is there's almost 68 nonprofits for every Vermonter, when the national average is about 220. So we're about 3 times the national average, and it has been said that Vermont has more nonprofits per capita than any other state. But so that's just puts in some form of perspective, and when you think of it, and we'll be getting into this later on, if I understand it, the minimum number of board members a nonprofit must have is 3?
That's right. By law, it's 3. We recommend upwards of 7 or more just to make a healthy board, but 3 is the legal minimum.
So if you have 7,500 boards in Vermont, and there's an average of 7 or 10, I mean, the math is pretty clear. I mean, you're in the tens of thousands of board members. And at the same time, I should point out that this does not cover religious organizations, municipalities, fire districts, school districts. This is just the nonprofit world. And, and we have a number of those other boards with 250 some odd school districts, school boards in Vermont. Right. You mentioned the minimum number. Can you tell us a little bit about what the law is in Vermont, in that there is a law that governs nonprofit boards or nonprofit?
Yeah, and I think it's important that there's a bit of a difference here. We're going to use the term nonprofit in this conversation, and that generally means an organization that has incorporated itself in the eyes of the states. They've sent paperwork into the Secretary of State's office. They've enunciated a mission. They've got some board members, and they're going to exist as a corporation. There are a lot of charities that exist in Vermont. Say your neighbor gets hurt in an accident, or has a house burned down, and you and some other folks get together and raise money. That's also a charity, and it's a not-for-profit, obviously. That is governed a little bit differently, but the question about board members really gets to these incorporated nonprofits, these official charities, public benefit corporations we call them. Those organizations are governed by a title of the Vermont Code, so it's like all the other laws in Vermont. And there are a number of different requirements for boards, whether it's the number of board members, how meetings are held, the requirement for a number of members to make a decision, things like that are all laid out in that code. And what we've done with a publication that we hope to get out in the next month is really break that down in a digestible way for folks who are currently serving on boards, and especially for folks who are considering service on boards.
I'm going to cover that shortly. I'm glad you brought that up. But there are a set of rules that govern your position as a board member. Do you feel that many board members are aware of that? And what's your gut? Smiling.
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting question. Because I think there are two answers here. One is, I don't think a lot of board members think, oh, there are some laws I need to follow, in the same way that we as citizens think I need to follow the speed limit, I shouldn't steal. But by the same token, I think board members, by and large, maybe virtually all board members, are still following the law whether they know it or not. They're following the important steps of taking appropriate responsibility for the funds that those nonprofits hold, overseeing any employees they may have in an appropriate manner, and generally operating within the bounds of the law. What we want to do is make sure that they're at least meeting that minimum threshold of the law, and really aspiring to achieve best practices across the board in terms of how they operate their organizations, because a healthy nonprofit sector is using funds efficiently and appropriately as the donors, largely Vermonters, want them to. They're doing great works out in the community and using the funds that they're getting towards those good works. And they're operating in a manner that is compliant for their employees and anyone else they interact with. And that's really what we want to do, is a lot of education around this.
I should mention to our audience, my guest today is Todd Daloz. He's the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Vermont. And Todd is make sure I have this right, you're a graduate of Oberlin College.
I am.
And also received your law degree from the University of California, the Hastings College of Law.
That's correct.
And been with the Attorney General's office for a few years now, but prior to that, you clerked for one of our Supreme Court justices.
I did.
Are you from Vermont?
I am. I grew up in the Northeast Kingdom, Glover and St. Johnsbury. That's where I spent the
you're
first
back,
18
you're back
years.
home.
Oh, absolutely.
What was it like, just as a quick aside, working as a clerk, a law clerk for the one of the justices of the Supreme Court?
It's a tremendous experience. The court is, on top of being a group of extremely intelligent and dedicated jurists, they're lovely people, and it's a rare and special opportunity to get to be a colleague, to the extent a law clerk is a colleague to a justice, with those folks, and really get a sense of how they really look at every single case that comes before them, deeply consider not just the specifics of the conflict, if it is a true conflict, before them, but also the broader implications that all their decisions have. It was a great 2-year experience, and I really treasure it.
And Vermont is somewhat unique in that almost every case can be appealed to the Supreme Court. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's, I can't speak for the experience of being a justice, obviously, but viewing it from that perspective, it's a tremendous workload that they face. I mean, it's hundreds of cases a year go up to the Supreme Court, and the justices take time to review virtually all of them.
And from there, you moved over you went down the street to the Attorney General's office. But if I'm correct, you're not solely working in the area of the nonprofits. You have a few other responsibilities.
I do. I mean, I think a lot of us at the Attorney General's office wear a lot of different hats. Nonprofit regulation is a piece of what I do. There's some related work I do involving paid fundraisers, which are by and large for-profit corporations that nonprofits or charities may contract with to do telemarketing, essentially. I do some work in civil litigation and some other consumer protection kind of work.
And Todd and I have chatted before, and I mentioned to him that there's quite a difference between what goes on in Vermont's Attorney General's office and what goes on over in New York State. The Attorney General in New York has a fairly large department, the Charities Bureau. You're familiar with that?
I am.
And do you ever see us getting more involved, more similar to what's going on in New York? Do you feel a need for that here in Vermont? Because if I can say something from behind the scenes, Todd doesn't work full-time on nonprofits. Is that correct?
That's
and
true.
Yet, it's, as we mentioned, it's 20% of the state economy.
It is a large sector of the state's economy. I think it's difficult to answer that question for a couple reasons. Several years ago, there was a trade organization for the nonprofit sector called VANPO, the Vermont Association of Nonprofits Organizations. And VANPO folded for a number of different reasons, but it was an industry trade group that provided a conduit and a informal regulatory structure, shall we say, for the nonprofit sector. It was a clearinghouse of information. It had a pulse for what was going on in the sector, and I think by and large we haven't had a focused group like that since. I think there are a number of nonprofits, Common Good Vermont doing a terrific job on the educational front. The Vermont Community Foundation obviously is a major funder of a lot of nonprofits in Vermont and does a great job of paying attention to what's going on in the sector. Our office is sort of grabbing the reins again, but largely what we're looking at is a proactive educational stance. I think, there are two sides to what I do. One side is the education component, like this conversation, like the guidance we're putting out in the next month, that really focuses on educating board members, helping them understand what their role is, and keeping the sector healthy for that reason. The other side of it is that we do have to enforce at times. We do find, we get complaints from board members, from members of organizations, sometimes from donors, about how money is being spent, how nonprofits are running. And that's really sort of the other side of the coin for what we do. What happens in New York, obviously New York has a much larger nonprofit sector, perhaps not as a portion of their economy, but certainly compared to Vermont, they're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars in assets. And I think they have a lot more instances of fraudulent charities. We haven't seen a lot of fraudulent charities in Vermont, which is a major component of the work that other charities bureaus do. And absent that kind of level of real people just out there pretending they're going to do good works with the money and then running off to Acapulco or wherever, that's not largely what we're seeing in Vermont. What we're seeing is a need for education, a need for further information, and a need for support rather than a need for a big stick to come in and put people in jail or levy heavy fines. That's not to say we don't have those cases, but we have yet to see the need to expand much beyond this proactive phase.
Are there any plans to find out if nonprofits are actually doing the mission they're supposed to do, short of running off to the Caribbean with the money? I mean, because there's a lot of, you've had some complaints recently about boards and board members and organizations not carrying out the mission that they were, that they had subscribed that they would do. How do you enforce that? How do you, if you hear that, how do you step in then? And do you have an enforcement, or is it you?
There's more than just me, I should say
Okay.
that, and it does depend on exactly how what the complaint looks like when it comes in, and it's largely complaint-driven. I mean, we're not out there snooping into nonprofits, looking at their federal tax filings to determine if there are problems. But certainly, when we get a complaint, we take it seriously. We have investigative staff that may make some follow-up phone calls, may look at publicly filed documents, may request further information from the nonprofit. And as with other investigations, we proceed step by step to determine, is this something where we need to take formal action? Is this a circumstance where we can speak with the board and see if there's an opportunity for resolution in that manner? But when we choose to really step in and make it a full investigation, we tend to resolve it with a public agreement, some sort of public settlement agreement with the organization about how they're going to operate in the future based on our findings and what we uncovered. Now, there also may be circumstances where our investigation turns up nothing untoward happened or even dissuades any belief that there was something wrong. And those are great. We prefer those. It's an opportunity to educate and to not use our resources or, importantly, the charities' resources, fighting a battle that doesn't need to happen.
Have you ever had to step in recently to remove a board? Because that's within your jurisdiction. I believe the Attorney General has even talked about that. Well, the last year there was some incident over on the eastern side of the state.
There was, and that was an unfortunate experience for I think the organization, obviously, and our office really worked hard not to take that step. That's what we really consider the last option. Removing a board suggests that a board has violated its duty of responsibility to the organization's finances, the duties, the fiduciary duty, which is the core element of what a board needs to carry out. In that particular instance, it was a small organization doing important work, human services work, but largely it was a dysfunctional board where it was a 3-member board, which is the legal minimum, but part of the reason we recommend more than that is circumstances like this where the organization had 2 members who had been with the organization, one since its founding, so they had been on the board almost 20 years, 15 plus, and the other, another member who had been on for a very long time, had very close relationship with the executive director, and then we had an outlying board member who, through personal conflicts and concerns about the finances of the organization, they came at loggerheads. And we stepped in, attempted to mediate, attempted to have further conversation with the board. Ultimately, the board didn't seem to be responding to our recommendations and requests for changes, and we petitioned the court to remove the board. Following that, I'm happy to say we had a productive conversation with the board, ultimately withdrew our petition to withdraw. So we didn't actually go through with it. The board resigned, and through further investigation, it was determined that the organization was already on a path towards financial failure and is currently in the process of receivership, winding up its corporate affairs.
You mentioned earlier that you're complaint-driven, meaning if you get a complaint from trustees or the public and so forth. Do you also look to find out what's going on that you read in the papers or the newspapers about a nonprofit organization, if they have any issues? There was one recent, wasn't in the newspapers. Well, it was in the newspapers down here on a college in Burlington. I think it was Burlington College. I may be wrong about that. But there was a big question about their reporting of pledges and what have you. Now, does your office, when you see something in the newspapers, do you follow up on it, or do you wait for something more concrete than that?
We certainly don't turn a blind eye to media reports. It's important to triangulate information that we get through the media. And so there are times where we will see reporting in local publications, statewide publications, national publications that raise concerns that we may follow up on either informally, just requesting information, or formally through a full investigation. So I think that's an important point. It's not purely complaint-driven in the sense of someone contacting our office to complain. We are aware of and attempt to remain aware of media reports as well and other sources of information that may, including our own experiences as Vermonters.
I should point out, in my other life, I was a real estate developer and worked obviously here in Vermont and in other places, but specifically here in Vermont. And when we would do a project, we would have Act 250 monitor us. They're enforcement people. We'd go through Act 250 before the project.
Right.
Then we'd have Water Resources come down and look at us. We'd have VOSHA come down and look at us. We had state agencies proactive looking at what we were doing. And I don't know how big the real estate development market is in Vermont, but I'm sure it's substantial, but probably not as large as the nonprofit. So I'm just wondering, again, I'm asking myself, and I've been in the nonprofit world for over 50 years. Did my first audit when I was with Arthur Anderson in 1964, and of a nonprofit. And I like to believe what you're, and I share what you're saying. Not only like to believe, but given the fact that there are 7,000, and that's just the nonprofits, not to mention the municipalities.
Right.
That I'm just wondering if if we should not have a little bit more, but I'll leave that up to you. A little bit more enforcement and a little bit more review. Be more proactive is what I'm saying.
I think, as I said before, it's not something our office has. To use perhaps an ill-apt analogy, we don't see a lot of smoke for the need to control a fire that we don't necessarily know exists. And it's possible that through our proactive education that we're ramping up now, we will get more reports, we will get more complaints, and that may lead to a shift in policy. But at this point, the concept of doing the kind of workplace safety or environmental protection that exists in the real estate development realm, in the example you give, doesn't seem warranted in Vermont at this point. Now, and I also think there are important countervailing considerations to think about in terms of how a nonprofit operates, what donors are giving the money to nonprofits for. On the one hand, we do want to make sure if you give money to preserve land or to run a soup kitchen or some other program, that money is actually going to go, by and large, to that cause. We want to make sure that happens. But part of any kind of regulatory scheme is going to be compliance, and that's also going to cost nonprofits money. And we want to be aware of, cognizant about, and appreciative of how nonprofits are allocating already slim resources. $4 billion sounds like a lot, but I guarantee that if we talk to some folks on the front lines of mental health agencies, of homeless agencies, they could do with more. Mm-hmm. And if they were spending a lot of money to comply with some other kind of government regulation, I think we would have to think long and hard about imposing that kind of burden on nonprofits. Again, unless we saw a significant need, and at this point, we don't hear that.
I don't want to spend too much time on that aspect of it, but your metaphor about you don't see a lot of smoke reminds me of testifying before the legislature a few years ago with Tom Salmon, the former state auditor, on the trying to enhance the controls of municipalities. And one of the legislators, when I was up there testifying, said to me, Mr. Keelan, do we see a lot of smoke here? And I said, well, here's my list of $5 million that had been taken last year from municipalities. Now, how much smoke do you want? But I hope that we're not having major issues, obviously. But
well, and Don, if I could jump in, I think that's a great point about embezzlement. And one important distinction is part of our nonprofit regulation is really about ensuring money is being used appropriately, boards are acting in a manner that is consistent with their mission and forwarding the organization. If we get to the point of a crime, and those examples of the various folks in municipalities walking away with $5 million or more, those become criminal investigations which take on a whole new level. And I think perhaps we're not catching embezzlers as well as we could, but the way we see an important preventative measure, it's not the only one, but an important preventative measure is active, engaged boards. We haven't taken the step to penalize a board for the acts of its employees. And we hope we wouldn't have to ever do that, especially if boards are engaged in and involved in the process in reviewing their finances.
That happened in New York, as I may have mentioned to you, with the James Beard Foundation, I believe. A number of board members were fined by the Attorney General for failing to do their job. Let me ask another question, and that is from the publication that the office is going to produce. I'm a new board member, and I'd like to know, what liabilities do I have that I could be personally liable in operating working on the board of a nonprofit?
Well, that's difficult to say because it'll depend on the nonprofit, but certainly there's an example going on across the border in New Hampshire where there was a large community action program. So they were doing things like heating oil assistance, soup kitchens, a lot of different services for folks in Coos County and Grafton County. I believe those are the two counties or Tri-County, I don't know what the third was. And the board there, my understanding is that the board there was not paying attention to how the monies were being spent, and that the executive leadership was taking money from, let's say, the heating oil assistance program, using it to pay for the soup kitchen program. And the money was getting shifted around so much that, in fact, it was sort of a Ponzi scheme. They were getting more and more money, and I don't mean to use that pejoratively. I think all the money, again, was going towards good purposes, but ultimately they had more pots to fill than money to fill it with. And the board was so asleep or not focused on what was going on at the organization that, in fact, they're now going to be liable for some of the monies that were not spent. That's a possibility for any board. It's important that when a board member takes on that role, they recognize that they are a fiduciary for the organization. They're responsible for stewarding the money. They're responsible for ensuring that funds are used appropriately. And ultimately, if an organization fails or some kind of action is taken against the organization, they could be financially liable. And that's why directors and officers insurance exists out there in the world. And I think for certain organizations of a certain size with certain exposure, that makes tremendous sense. One piece to consider there is, and this is why we suggest boards should look to legal advice from a qualified, experienced attorney, from a certified public accountant, from other advisors who can help them determine what is their exposure in a given circumstance, what is their financial liability, and what are the best ways to use their scarce resources to protect themselves and continue furthering the mission.
Do you? I understand one of the areas that a board member can be responsible for if the board, if the organization is failing to pay its payroll taxes, and that's a huge problem with the IRS. Last year, I believe, 2 years ago, there was something over several billions of dollars where nonprofits had not sent in the payroll taxes, and I believe the IRS holds boards responsible for that, especially if you were a financial person on a board.
There's certainly financial people on the board can be held to a higher standard. That's possible. I don't know exactly what the IRS's enforcement protocol is in terms of how they seek to recoup that money. But that's a great point, that it's important for boards to understand, especially boards for organizations that have employees. I mean, we certainly have a good number of the 7,500 that are all volunteer, that are running their own organizations. But boards that have employees, they need to comply with unemployment compensation, workers' compensation, payroll taxes, non-discrimination policies. They act as an employer, and it's an honor to be on a board. It speaks to your community involvement, your wisdom, your connections, a lot of different aspects. But there are also real responsibilities that are incumbent on those board members, and that can have, as you point out, real results that I think a lot of folks who join in to help the local library don't necessarily think about. And I think it's important that board members consider them. We still want, as you say, we're looking at 75,000 potentially board members spots out there.
Just in nonprofits.
Just in nonprofits, and we want people to continue performing that vital service for the state, but we want them doing it with their eyes open, going in and really taking a considered view of what they're doing.
Two of the problems I've seen over the years of helping nonprofits that, and I believe you addressed them in your guide, in your publication, would be confidentiality. Mm-hmm. What board members hear at a board meeting stays at the board meeting, and I'm going to ask you to comment on that in a second. And the other one, which I was surprised in your publication, board members sometimes have to step in and actually operate the organization. And yet, I believe if I read the Vermont statute correctly, one of your responsibilities is not to interfere in the operations.
Right.
And the question I have, if Don Keelan was to, like here at this nonprofit, I step in and I'm actually operating the camera here as a board member. And do I take on, I'm going to put it this way, do I lose my board immunity that Vermont provides to board members? I'm no longer a board member, I'm working in the operation.
Well, there are a couple different
I
pieces
may
there.
have been a little bit complicated there.
Let me start with the second, or your hypothetical. I think it is important to distinguish when an individual, Don Keelan, operates as a board member on the board, and when Don Keelan, an individual, operates as a volunteer or other employee of the organization.
Non-paid employee.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are a number of different ways in which that scenario plays out. One important one is when an individual board member talks to an individual employee of the organization and says, hey, can you get me X, Y, and Z? It's important to recognize when the board needs something, then it's a directive from the organizational voice, the head of the organization. When an individual board member asks for something, it may just be an individual board member asking for something, and staff have to learn how to appropriately balance those requests. In an ideal world, in a good nonprofit, it's sort of two different pyramids, one on top of the other, with the focal point being the management team. So the board is going to focus its attention and requests on the management team, and the management team is going to carry it out through the body of the organization. Now, as we say, among these 7,500 organizations in Vermont, there are a good number that may not have employees or sufficient number of employees. Board members are going to be cooking dinner. Board members are going to be driving cars. And in those instances, they're operating, by and large, as volunteers of the organization, and need to consider that fact separate from their board service when they're acting as a board.
And they're protected under Vermont law from negligence, not gross negligence, but negligence. I mean, they have immunity, do they not, by being a volunteer?
It would depend on the circumstances. I can't say that absolutely.
Okay.
But I think in any circumstance, the organization can face liability. We're not a state that has blanket immunity for nonprofits.
Let me, I knew we should have gone an hour, but let me ask one other question, or two questions. One is, can you tell us a little about the publication that's going to be coming out from your office, and when might we be able to see that, and how can people be in touch with the Attorney General's office to get that?
Sure. The publication should be out within the next several weeks. I'd say certainly before the giving season, right around Thanksgiving on through the holidays and the beginning of the new year. The goal of that publication, as I've said, is to educate current board members about their duties, their responsibilities, their rights. There are a number of different sections broken down in a way that we really hope will let people read the whole guidance and get a number of different, a broader understanding, but also focus in on certain areas if they want to do that, to understand more about their fundraising obligations or perhaps questions they want to ask before joining a board. Beyond that, we plan on not only having it available as a pamphlet, but also placing it on the Attorney General's website, where people can click into various different aspects of board service, understand a little bit more as we begin to provide more online resources about how nonprofits can incorporate. The Secretary of State has a great website for that, but also understanding what happens upon dissolution when a nonprofit winds up. What do you do with the assets? How do you limit your liability once the organization is closed? And all of those things we hope to have on the website, certainly within the next several months. We're not in complete control of how the website gets updated, but so that it's available not just through the office, but online as well. And we hope to continue providing those resources. And through that guidance, we've also got a number of other resources, nationally recognized resources that are available. As I said before, Common Good Vermont is a great resource that's available locally here.
And how would someone be in touch with your office? I mean, is there a website at the Attorney General? I'm sure there's a web address.
There's ago.vermont.gov, Attorney General's office.vermont.gov, is the web address. And on that, charities is housed under the consumer protection area. So folks go to the website, click on the consumer protection link, they'll find a charities segment. As I said, it's under construction, so it doesn't have as much information as we've talked about certainly today, but we anticipate in the coming months providing more of that information out there for folks so they can get it.
Well, Todd, thank you so much for being here with us. The half hour, actually it's more than a half hour, it's 35 minutes, went by in a flash. Thank you very much.
Don, thank you for having me.
Appreciate you having, and good luck with the publication.
Thank you very much.